They are also referenced in our post-meeting emails that we've been sending out as well. So we are going to do roll call in just a moment. And just as another reminder, all comments made in the chat pod are technically written public comments. So please just be aware of that as well. We do encourage people to use their video camera during the meeting if possible. It's just really nice to see y'all's faces, especially during a time when in meeting conversations in person just don't happen as often. So we thank y'all in advance. As a reminder, today, our objectives, we're going to do a quick recap of previous meeting information. We're going to discuss existing entities and their authorities and functions. We'll discuss potential organizational structure, as well as potential resources for the governance structure itself. And the Regional Steering Committee, just as a reminder, our goals, we have two pretty big ones right now. So the first is to develop the long-term governance structure. We'll have that provisional recommendation prepared at the end of January, and that's why we're spending a lot of time in these meetings really deliberating that process. And we're also going to be identifying projects to recommend for funding, but that's not due till June 2021. So we have a little bit of time to kind of sit in on that. Thank you to those of you who are putting your name and organizational affiliation in the chat box. That's much appreciated. And then I want to toss it over to Chuck and Ross. So Chuck is our vice chair, Ross is our chair, just to say a couple of words.
Just thank everybody for.
Go ahead, Chuck. I was having technical difficulties.
Okay. Thank everybody for being with us during these unique times that we have. You know, we've got multiple hurricanes that have occurred. We've got a pandemic. We've got elections going on and all kind of other crazy stuff. I know my parents have tested positive for COVID and they are, you know, up and down with it right now. So.
Yep, just want to, you know, thank everybody again, just like Chuck did. You know, Rachel and her team spent a lot of time putting everything together, so they always do a great job. So I expect another great meeting. So I'm anxious to get it started.
Yeah,
Great.
if Ross and I look like we know what we're doing, it's because of Rachel's team.
I agree.
Well, that's a part of the reason why y'all are at the table, right? We're all experts in our own right, and that's certainly what we're here for, is to provide support. One additional way that we are going to be providing support is that today we'll be using a round robin facilitation technique. Basically what that means is I'm just writing down the names of our steering committee members as they enter the virtual room that is. And so for discussions, we're just gonna kind of go in order of those folks and just make sure that we're hearing from everybody. And there's no pressure on that. If you do not want to respond, you are not required to. So you can also say, hey, I'm choosing to pass right now, and that's okay. No pressure. So we are going to go ahead and go into roll call. So what's going to happen is I'm going to list your name. We will go in alphabetical order in terms of parish affiliation, and then we'll go in alphabetical order for our regional folks. So do we have Mike Enlow and or Ron Savoy with Ascension Parish?
Hey, good afternoon. Mike Enlow is here. How's everyone?
Hey, Mike, doing good. Thank you so much for joining us today. Much appreciated. Let me see, Tom Stevens and or Fred Rayford with EDR.
I think Fred is coming in from the waiting room now. He may be working on audio.
Perfect. And I thought I saw Tom enter the room earlier, so we will confirm that in just a moment. Yeah, I do see Tom, so maybe he had to step away for a moment. Perfect. Well, Fred and Tom, we acknowledge that y'all are on the call, so thank you for joining us. Do we have James Stewart and or Joni Stone with East Feliciana? Okay. Not hearing anything, so I will probably pause in a moment to send a text to ask if they'll be able to join us. I do believe John Clark said that their offices were closed today, but I do want to do a call for John Clark. Are you on the line with us with Iberville? Okay. Not hearing John. Can't blame him for taking the day off when his office is closed. Excuse me. Mark Harrell and or Steve Kistler. I think we heard Steve earlier.
You show Steve is signed in.
Perfect. Thank you. We have you recorded, Steve. Earl Mathern and or Stephanie Bruning. I think you spoke up
Hey,
earlier,
this is
Earl.
Earl. I'm here.
Hey, Earl. Thanks for making it official. Do we have Major Coleman and or Jeremy Williams with St. Helena? Okay, missing them. So I will also send a quick text just as a reminder. Do we have Ryan Donahue and or Ryan LaRousse with St. James today? Okay, I think we're missing them as well, but I think they might have also had the day off. Devin Foyle and or Renee Pastrick with St. John. Okay. I think we're missing them as well. I feel like our Saints might have had this day off for All Saints Day. And Ross, we just heard from you, so thank you for being here with us. Do we have Bridget Bailey and or Melissa Cowart?
This is Bridget. I'm here.
Hey, Bridget, thanks for joining today. Much appreciated.
No problem.
Bobby Joe, I think we heard from you just a minute ago.
Yes, ma'am, I'm here.
Thank you for joining. Gary Migo and or Emily Koss.
Yeah, this is Gary. I'm here.
Thanks, Gary. Appreciate you being on the line.
No problem.
Let me see, Dietmar Reach here and or Larry Bankston.
I'm here. Larry's here.
Great, thank you, Larry. Karen Zito and or Diane Baum.
Hi, this is Karen Zito.
Thanks, Karen. Appreciate you. Chuck gave us a part of our welcome, so we definitely know Chuck is here. Thank you. Do we have Ronnie Carter and or Kim Coates?
Ronnie Carter's here.
Hey, Ronnie. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, y'all. Thank you to everybody else who has joined. If you have joined as we've been making our way through our introductions, please put your name and organizational affiliation and perhaps your parish, if applicable, in the chat box. That just helps us kind of keep record of who's been here. And it's really helpful on our end as we think about metrics for who's been engaging in the conversation, at least virtually. So we are well on our way in our agenda. We just finished up our introductions and meeting and logistics. So we are going to do a recap of previous meeting items with a special focus on October 13th, because that was the most recent one that we did. Go ahead and make this box a little smaller. There we go. All right, so this is from our September 1st meeting, but just a reminder to ground into what has been a really great structure that is put together by Dr. Thomas Dowsett. So it's the 4 R's. And we think about this in the context of building out our governance structure specifically. So there are rules that exist within governance structures, resources, relationships, and reporting. We have been spending a lot of time focusing on the rules and relationships aspects. We will continue to focus on the relationships aspects today, and we'll start to crack the egg on the resources conversation as well. So the questions that you see that are in the box, are things that we're going to be working to answer throughout time. So as a reminder, the discussions that we're having are to deliberate the build out of that governance structure. None of these conversations are final. We will vote on the provisional recommendation at the end of January for our January 28th meeting. So every single moment in time when we're talking about this, it's not finalized or set in stone. We're continuing the discussion and conversation. And we will eventually, I think for the December meeting, start to present a couple of different frameworks for y'all to deliberate between, for y'all to pick apart and say, we like this particular element of this one, or this is not going to work. So just keep in mind that's what we're building towards. So as a part of that process, we have been deliberate about building this out. So all the way since September, where we started with identifying the root causes for flooding, which could then help us inform what the purpose of the structure will be, all the way to where we are now, where we're really going to think really long and hard about relationships within that structure today. So what does the representative body look like? And then working through November 19th, our meeting in a couple of weeks, we'll get much more nitty-gritty into the resources, which will then inform the reporting part of that governance structure as well. And so once we get to January and we vote for the provisional governance recommendation for Region 7, we are certainly not done there. Evelyn, do you want to explain a little bit more about our process once we have the provisional recommendation?
Sure, thank you. Just let me know if y'all are having issues with my audio. I think you can hear me. So right now you can tell we are in the phase where we're getting toward the moment of making recommendations by this group, but we're not yet to that meeting. Of course, this is still very deliberative, as Rachel is noting. Going into the sort of first part of 2021, you're looking at kind of vetting that recommendation and making sure that you're bringing your work to the parts of the community that you represent, and getting them to kind of co-sign what you've done, or seeing if there are places where maybe you could tweak or improve that recommendation. And then considering that feedback in the latter, or sort of in the summer part of that year, you have an opportunity to come back and refine that recommendation. If you find that things have changed, or that you thought you had a recommendation that was a great fit, but maybe you've rethought some aspects of that. The point is that you're not locked in if you find that the situation demands a readjustment. So that's what this is all about. You guys are doing a great job, you know, in every meeting, really thinking through these issues that are really difficult to tackle. So just thanks again to the group.
Yeah, thanks, Evelyn. And just echoing that, thanks to the group. Y'all have shown up consistently, and we really couldn't do this work without y'all. So thank you. So going into our October 13th meeting and some of the takeaways from that, we spent some time grounding in, you know, government, like the similarities between governance systems and ecosystems. So just like trees have their own roots and networks that they actually send resources through and send messages through, so do people. And y'all will recall this network map that is actually from Dr. Douthit and Lindsay Lamanna's work that they've been working on. So people do that too, right? We have our own networks, and that's how we share resources, that's how we share information. So really thinking about what are the similarities and differences that exist between governance systems and ecosystems, and how we can derive really taking a more ecosystem-based approach in this work, even as we think about something as nebulous as a governance structure. We also spent some time explaining what a HUC is, a hydrologic unit code. And so if you'll remember, basically the smaller the number, so a HUC4 is larger in region size compared to a bigger number. So a HUC4 is bigger than a HUC12. So HUC4 is really regional across the United States interstates. HUC6 is a bit smaller and it's interstate, and that also nests within the HUC4. Then you have HUC8, which is the same scale at which our models that are being, where DOTD is managing the consultants and contracts, are HUC8 models. Those will be developed as HUC8 models specifically. So we have a lot of those that run vertical across the North Shore and up into Mississippi. There are about 7 to 9 of them, if my brain is serving me correctly today. And we have HUC10s, which are smaller. So those are sub-parish level. And HUC12, which in some cases, depending on the size of your municipality, might be about the same size as your municipality. So just as a reminder of that, they are also used as a coding system by the USGS. So instead of saying, hey, this is the watershed that is so many, miles to the north of Main Road, They actually say, oh, it's Huck 12, 2, 9, 7, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever. So it's just a way to catalog so that people are consistent whenever they're talking about the work that they're describing from a scientific perspective, as well as a natural resource management perspective. We also talked about the existing organizations and scales of decision making. So really bringing in that time component as well. So we know our risk is changing over time. It has changed from the past to what it is today and will continue to change in the future. And we know that different organizations work and operate at different scales themselves. So some of them are working at the sub-municipal scale all the way up to really like being able to implement the work at a federal scale. We also spent some time talking about the provisional boundaries. So we had a really good discussion where I think what we ultimately ended up hearing was the boundaries should remain the same unless there's a good reason to change them. So once again, that was not a conversation where it was an official vote or anything. Y'all will see the Region 7 boundaries within the provisional recommendation, as well as the governance framework that are going to be proposed based on our conversations. So once again, that was not a voting conversation, but it was meant to be a robust discussion just to kind of see what people were thinking. And so we are right on time, y'all. We are going to now shift. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Evelyn take over because we are going to have our friends, David Lessinger and Nika Scott, actually walk us through the policy guidebook. We're going to drop this in the chat box one more time. If I can get the chat box, there it is. There we go. To open up. So the second link that says policy guidebook is what we are referencing here. We're going to have them walk us through the purpose of it, what the goals of that document were, and really thinking about how it is meant to be used and not used. So if you get that document pulled up, pages 66 through 74 specific to Region 7. You can go through and look at all the other regions if you'd like to. And I think focusing on Region 7 and then the introduction as well as the final pages within that document are probably, if you got limited time, where you should focus most of your time on. So I'm going to toss it over to our friends now to be able to explain that. I'm going to go on mute.
Okay, I just want to make sure y'all can see this document. I'm scrolling through pretty slowly. I have it kind of zoomed in, so patience while we roll through this. And I want to make sure that David is able to get to his audio, and same thing with Nika. When y'all are ready, go ahead and take it away.
Great, thank you, Evelyn. This is David Lessinger with CSRS. I'm a program management consultant to the Office of Community Development, and I'm joined today by Nika Scott, who's an attorney with Baker Donaldson. Nika, are you able to join us as well by audio?
Yes, I'm by audio.
Great. I'll give a little introduction and then also let Nika chime in with some of the more detailed analysis that her team did in terms of putting together the research for this guidebook. So thanks to all of you on the steering committee and beyond in Region 7 for having us on today. The purpose of the guidebook that Evelyn's got up on the screen was really twofold. One was to survey the existing landscape of authorities of various entities in Louisiana that touch water management in some way or another. And the second goal was to give you all, as the Regional Steering Committee, a sense of who your stakeholders might be beyond just who's in the room now, as you go forward and begin to build out your watershed entity and the planning that you'll be doing. So in the first goal, you know, there's a lot of existing entities on the books and state statutes, and we wanted to make sure that where there may be duplicative authority or geographic jurisdiction, that was able to be seen. So we've mapped many of these entities. And then we've also tried to draw a comparison across them. And when you do that, it's a little bit difficult because state statute isn't very specific, as many of you know, about, you know, the specific rule or action that an entity might take. It often provides broad powers and authorities, and then the specific rules are usually promulgated by the entities themselves. So there may be cases, and we've already started to get some feedback from Rachel and Thomas and others, that, you know, in some cases, some of these categories might be a little confusing or tricky because we've taken a broader range of entities and kind of combine them for the sake of making it a readable document and making it a simplified document. But if there are any specific questions about, you know, a particular entity, or in some cases, one or more entities will have more than one designation, we'd be happy to take those and go through those with any of you. So what Evelyn's scrolling through now is the specific set of statutes also that are cited. So you're also welcome to go and read them and discover it. For me personally, it was very interesting to just understand just how fragmented it is, just because there are so many single purpose entities that are established for you know, the purpose of, let's say, managing a particular water body, a lake, a river, either for navigation purposes or for flood management purposes, but not necessarily having a requirement to, you know, engage in a larger regional network or decision-making framework. And obviously that's why we're all here today. So in that part, it was very illuminating. So hopefully it will be useful for you as well. Nika, do you want to take a minute and just kind of describe some of the research methods that your team used to put together the baseline research for the document?
Sure, David. So we started out with a pretty wide-ranging search of revised statutes, muni code, you know, for municipalities and parishes, general website searches for every entity that we had in our database, if there was a website. We eventually came to input of almost, I want to say, 2,000 entities into this database. And some of the things we looked for, we obviously included all the statutory language that gave each entities the powers and the authority and the things that they're able to do under the law. But to the extent we could find it online or through some other database, we would put input information such as the history and mission of that entity, what kind of flood management responsibilities they had. We have 12 attorneys, I think, working on this project, and we did it in a really quick time frame. So, you know, just to reiterate what David said, we're happy to hear any kind of input, advice, solicitation, any questions that you may have in regard to the data that you see in this guidebook, so that you can kind of use it more as a resource and kind of as an illustrative, you know, piece of work, so that we can kind of plan and look forward to where everyone may want to go from a regional perspective.
Thanks, Nika. So with that as an introduction, I'm happy to stop there. And if people have specific questions or comments, I'm happy to get into the discussion further. Or did you want us to actually look at Region 7 in detail as a group?
Yeah, I think if we could do that, David, and maybe go to a couple of the takeaway tables, I think that'll be really, really helpful in informing or prompting some of those questions.
Sure. So the first table is just this list of entities that anyone that touches, you know, drainage or water management in one way or another. The next is a set. This comparison table we took a selected set of entities for illustrative purposes, because it would be too big a table to have so many, you know, as you saw in the previous table, all in one. And because there are a lot of similar, you know, drainage districts or others that have the exact same powers. And so we try to do an illustrative table. And what we've done here is create categories like, you know, do they have some role within the building code in terms of issuing permits? Do they have some role within land use regulations? The main pattern that you will see jump out as you scroll through this table is that just about every power, most powers, are held at the parish or municipal level. So, you know, actual zoning, actual building code, enforcement, all that sort of thing, the ability to implement a lot of these projects are there. And that's one of the challenges, right? Is that most of this power is at the local level and not at a regional level. You will also see, though, especially at this part of the table that Evelyn has up now, that there are a lot of special purpose entities that do have the ability to tax, to raise taxes, to issue bonds. This does not reflect necessarily that they do have a millage in place, or that they have gone to the bond market and secured financing. This is just whether state statute allows them those powers. And so there are a lot of other steps oftentimes that would enable an entity to actually use those powers, right? Often, sometimes a popular vote is required. Other times, there's other steps along the way that an entity would need to do in order to use those powers. But what it shows to me, at least, what I take away from this table, is that we've created a lot of entities, and this is throughout the state, this is not just Region 7, that have the ability to implement projects, but don't necessarily have the ability to regulate development. On the other hand, you've got a parish and municipal governments that really have the ability to do both the regulatory work and also implement. What I think, though, is missing, and that's why we're all here, of course, is that connection that goes across. It says, what standards are we going to implement projects to? What types of regulatory measures or standards are we going to use when it comes to development? And at what level are we going to include that? And there's a role for state government in here as well, of course. And there's a role for, the regional entity that you all are envisioning. I'm just looking through the chat to see if there are any, and let me apologize in advance. I'm calling in, and so if reception is bad, my apologies in advance. Nika, did you want to add anything to this part of the comparison table?
No, not necessarily, other than, just these are more categories as opposed to specifics in regard to each one of these entities. And I think you did cover that. So some of it is very broad in scope as to what these specific entities' powers may have. I did see that we had a chat pop up from Russell Kelly, and his question was, how do we make sure critical, objective, and accurate data on elevations and flood are entered into this database, which are not reported by government? And I guess, Russell, to somewhat hopefully answer this question, we don't have, that information is not currently in this database. It's more kind of legal authorities for what each entity has. However, that's not to say that data cannot be entered. It's just not something that we looked at. We have given certain people access to the database just to review the information, but that's certainly something that we can talk about entering as a field, but it's not something that we have done.
Let me add to that response, Nika, too, that there are a lot of functions that you would want a regional entity or even a local entity that does water management to have that are not included in this guide because we are specifically looking at authority. So there are a lot of things like data management or community engagement that are not necessarily activities that require authority to be enabled, right? They are really critical functions that lots of different entities need to undertake, but they're not necessarily something that needs to be enabled in state law the way, let's say, taxing authority would be. So I also want to make sure that it's clear that this guidebook, while it does, look at a broad range of things, is limited to those things that need to be enabled by state law in terms of water management. I should also point out that there are a few rows that are blank, and we did that on purpose because there are a few functions that really nobody has, and there's some missing elements. So one example would be the local plan review, one that's on the screen now. There's really no entity that's required to there are some programs that have this, but from a statutory point of view, there's no requirement for, let's say, a local plan adoption to be reviewed and approved by a regional or state entity in the same way that other states have it when it comes to water management. So there are analogous things that we do, you know, in terms of other programs, but when it comes to, you know, let's say reviewing a watershed plan or a drainage master plan or something like that, and making sure it meets certain standards, there isn't a single entity that has that requirement under statute.
Russell, I saw in your comment in the chat, you said you could provide an example. I'm wondering if that gets to your question, or if you have an example you wanted to provide. Like, I'm curious if you were asking about development elevation standards, or maybe I was just misunderstanding your question.
Well, what it is flooding that is not reported by the parish. That, to be frank with you, I have repeatedly sent pictures of flooding to the parish from 2016, which was never updated and corrected. And East Baton Rouge Parish says there's no subsidence in East Baton Rouge Parish. And I've got certified surveys that prove this wrong, that make some areas of this parish possibly the fastest subsiding areas in the state. This is critical information that I have tried to get into the government system that has not been acknowledged. And this affects where I live and flooding. That is why I'm in on this call, because this data looks like it is being totally ignored. It's factual, it's proven, but it's not reported or documented. And I have sent some people in this call certified information proven to the effect that what I say is true. And I'm just trying to make sure that, let's say, mistakes from the past don't haunt us in this program also, as far as possibly making billion-dollar liabilities in the future because we missed stuff. That's it.
I also see that there is another question from Larry Bankston. Is there any other entity in the state like the Amite River Basin Commission? I am looking at the data that we have on them. I don't know if there's any specific entity exactly like them, but just looking at kind of their flood management responsibilities, I would think that maybe some of the regional flood protection authorities may have similar responsibilities, although the Amite River Basin Commission serves significantly more parishes than a regional flood protection authority. And I'm not sure if they actually construct or maintain flood protection projects like a regional flood authority would. But that's certainly something we can do. If you're interested in that specifically, we can search our database a little bit more and get back with you on a full answer if there is another entity exactly like there are very similar to the ARBC.
Thanks, Micah. I think that was a really great question, Larry. I appreciate that. I think I see more questions. Maybe, Larry, this sounds like it may be a question to the group. Do you want the regional authority to have local plan review, or would that stay with the parish? That seems like something, you know, that this group may want to deliberate on together.
And Evelyn, just before we get into that, let me try to clarify, because I think it was a little too vague in the table. In the guidebook, by plan review, I mean not a single development plan necessarily, like you're going to build a development and you're submitting plans for a permit, so much as a parish-wide or watershed-wide plan that says, here's what the data says, kind of what to our earlier caller was just discussing. You know, have we verified the data? Have we understood it? Have we set standards in relation to the risks? And have we changed or amended our policies and our projects based on this and new information and based on our, you know, the most up-to-date information that we have, so that we're making decisions in a coordinated fashion across the watershed, or even across watersheds within the state. And so by plan, I'm using sort of the capital P, if you will, an official plan that's adopted, but has to be reviewed to meet certain standards. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. I'm not talking about a single development, I'm talking about an overall plan.
Would anyone like to kind of jump in on Larry's question, or Larry, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, can you hear me? The question I have is, I think that this is fundamental. To what degree any authority that's created on a multi-parish level is going to supersede, which I'm not even sure constitutionally you could do that, but supersede the authority of the local governing body as to whether or not certain projects, getting down to the actual projects themselves, are authorized, and whether or not the standards, that if we're looking at broad standards, those standards, are they going to be accepted or rejected by East Baton Rouge Parish Metro Council or not? Is this authority set some minimum standards? I think that's a core determination that this group has to make.
Does anyone want to kind of see if that's something that's on their mind as well? Has anyone, you know, had some response to Larry's question that you want to share?
This is Bridget, and just from the regional perspective and looking at establishing maybe standards or minimum recommendations, I see our role as the aspect, not necessarily for governance with reviews for individual plans for developments that are going to happen in specific parishes or specific municipalities, as much as I see if we're looking at major projects for reducing, you know, flood impact, that could be something that if we're moving to propose something on either a parish level or multi-jurisdictional or collaborative effort between one or more jurisdictions, that the regional group would need to give a recommendation or review it or give it a, I don't know, either a thumbs up, thumbs down, because it would meet the region's perspective on what our actionable items and action plans should be or could be for its good practices for what we are endorsing as a collective regional group to prevent or reduce, you know, flood impact or protective factors. I see that being something that, whether it's legislatively or not, it would be an endorsement, and maybe at a higher level, state level, if you don't bring your project before the group and you're applying for state/federal funding that would impact a watershed, you would need to bring it to this group for that vetting and review, and basically a thumbs up or an endorsement, and receive that before it would be, you know, viable or I don't know, something that could be submitted for funding at that level. That's kind of how I saw this, is we would collectively come up with best practices, what we feel as a collective region, or what we need to be mindful of and putting into place, and any projects that would ultimately spend state or federal dollars that any entity would be asking for assistance with, even if there's a match for it, would be collectively looked at from that regional approach, not necessarily individual developments that are coming forward for approval through zoning or planning boards.
I'll just kind of chime in there, and I think it kind of speaks to what Bridget was saying, is that you know, if we're taking the approach of science and data to make better decisions. And the approach we're taking here is let's influence and get the support of the parishes and those local governments from the beginning, so they're all on board, so there's not overriding or superseding their decisions. It's getting them on board from the beginning to make maybe what's hopefully better decisions. Now, we'll say too that one of the ideas on the modeling aspect of it was not only to be able to review potential flood mitigation projects, but also to be able to review, you know, let's say certain areas proposed for development. We could, you know, that area could be modeled by the parish or the region and see what was the impacts of that development, both upstream and downstream and so forth. And on another item that, is there another entity like the Amite River Basin Commission? I don't know if it's like it, but there is something that maybe some are aware of. There's the Red River Compact, which is basically all the states of the Red River. You can have agreements to, instead of flood mitigation, it's maintaining a certain minimum flow.
This is Larry Bankston again. I think the ultimate question has to be, what do you view the function to be? The interrelation between what we're talking about here. I understood Bridget's comments about funding and multi-parish projects in which maybe this board or this group has some say or authority over. But what is the interrelation going to be between this entity that we're talking about proposing and its relationship with local government and or the Amite River Basin Commission? It has statutory authority. Are we undoing that? Are we supplementing that? Or is the Amite Basin, which already has the entire Hucks covered for that large portion, is that out of this? I think you've got to decide, are you providing data for parishes or local governments to consider? Are we looking at funding? I think that's a fundamental question that everybody needs to kind of get in their brain as to how we go forward.
Hey, this is Earl. My only warning would be is that you know, I tend, as a local, tend to lean towards this group being a more of a recommendation, more of a laying out a best management practice. And the main reason I say that is because even if I got every local elected official in the state of Louisiana to agree with you right now, today, that the group should have some authority, whatever that may be, in 8 years, all of those people are gone. And I have another group of local elected officials who think the last 8 years was all wrong. So they're going to want to do something completely different. So it'll be constantly trying to restructure this thing to have some authority, if it's rather than some kind of recommendation. Just say it.
Hey,
And I'll reiterate, I think this group is more supportive in laying out of best management practices and policies that are to make better decisions on flood mitigation. And I do think that if there's any funding coming through the state or federal, there'll be certain requirements that'll have to be met.
This is Bridget again. I have to say that I'm in agreement with what everyone's saying in that regard, but I think even whenever there is a change of guard, if you will, from one political, entity to the next, that is why I think it's so crucial for us as a regional group to have our own actionable items or action plans that specify what those best practices are that we endorse, as Chuck was alluding to. Regarding how things are either endorsed or not endorsed. And I don't think that would be fluid regardless of what the, political mindset would be in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. Because if our action plan and our goals are lined out as a regional group, and again, if funding is going to be contingent upon an endorsement by the group, then the basis of making either a favorable recommendation for moving forward for funding or not would be ultimately going back to whatever the group is looking at as our actionable items and plan that we say, as we establish it, if you will, as good practice. And it would be beneficial to whatever endeavor is being pitched if that endeavor meets those minimum standards and guidelines that we've adopted. And again, when it comes to the political will, well, if this is a precursor to say that you just have to have it vetted through this group and get their recommendation or stamp of approval, it's just it's making sure that whatever's being pitched for funding meets those minimum requirements for the best practices that we're looking at from the watershed perspective and level. I don't think, it needs to be 100% legislative, because sometimes that's just a policy. That is an internal policy. And I'm part of a group that gets safety money for transportation safety. And basically it's federal money that flows through the state, and the state changed their policy to say we have a regional group at each level. And if you're going to ask us for funding, number one, your funding priorities need to meet what the regional group has identified as their identified target areas. And number two, that you are participating with them to be mindful of the corridors that are impacted, and they have to know what you're proposing and planning. That way people aren't operating in silos. So in essence, just that regional group has to say, yes, we're aware of this proposal. It does meet our standards and what's in our regional plan of action for moving forward. And that's one more stamp that you have to have before you move forward and submit your full application to the state for funding. I think I see us being more of that kind of body, just so legislatively local government and local authority isn't modified or taken away. But if there's funding to do projects at a local level, they understand that the partnership and the collaboration regionally has to happen. It actually is kind of the carrot to kind of be the hook that pulls everyone to the table to know that we all need to work together to get this accomplished.
One thing I want to just kind of make sure to remind everyone as we're having this conversation is I saw another question, Larry, from you in the chat that said, is the goal here to draft actual legislation? I think it is important to remember that as this group discusses potential roles of the coalition, that you're not necessarily constrained by what's on the books right now, right? Like, I think that is kind of the point of this exercise, is that, if you find that the coalition that you envision needs to be legislatively enabled in some form and have a certain authority to manage the watershed in a way that's not being done today, that could be part of your recommendation, right? Is that clear how I'm describing it? That if you do need legislation to do what you have to do, I think that's, something to be considered. And that could potentially be on the table if the group decides that's what you need.
I think that's also a decision that's going to have to be made amongst all of the coalitions, just because, like I've mentioned before, my parish is in 3. So, it can't be that, or it shouldn't be that one of the watersheds requires a sign off for funding, but the other 2 don't. It just, that needs to be consistent.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Earl. And I've had some conversations with folks in Region 8 and 5 and 6 in particular, because we share a lot of boundaries with them. And they're at the same step in their deliberative process. And you know this better than I do, Earl, because you're a part of a few of those. If not all of them. I think maybe Stephanie sits on 8, but you know that better than I do. And I think grounding that back into the conversation for our folks who maybe don't sit on multiple committees just because their region isn't in other regions. We are going to have to think a lot about some really, really strategic coordination across the states or across the regions, not states. Maybe perhaps that too, but to be determined at a later date. I did wanted to throw out another question that I think came into the chat pod privately. I don't think that was intentional, but for David and Nika, from your review in Region 7, are there bodies that are set up to do a HUC 8 plan? And if there's a HUC 8 plan, is there anyone to facilitate consistency, coordination, or dialogue? And so, can we get grounded in some tangible examples, I think?
There are a couple of different items in that question, so let me sort of take them piece by piece. I think the short answer is that there's no one entity right now in any region across the state that has all the functions and authorities that you might want. And I think the questions have been raised already on this call. What do we want? But that you might want in a regional authority. Now, when it comes to coordination and facilitation, again, that's not necessarily something that requires a specific authority unless that facilitation and coordination is leading to some sort of state mandated or otherwise mandated outcome, right? So folks have already alluded to the fact that, like, if your project needs to get funded, you've got to be in alignment with a regional or state plan or other sorts of avenues by which that facilitation and coordination could turn into an official approval or authority. I think naturally the role of facilitator and coordinator is already being played in many regions across the state by the planning and development districts, by the regional planning commissions, partly because they already have a regional perspective, and so they already have boards that are formed of multiple stakeholders across those regions, and so they're already acting as a facilitator. In some cases, they're also acting on behalf of parishes, like contractually to do flood plain management and things like that. And so there's some natural roles that have formed, but I think the question is not so much what's happening as what do we want to happen. And so I think it's important, and that's why we thought it was important to return to state statute and say, just because something is or is not being done today doesn't mean that that's going to be our future state, right? What do we want our future state to be? And so I'm really pleased to hear the conversation already happening on the call today, where people are really narrowing in on the fundamental questions, which is what power lives at state government, what power lives at a future regional entity, and what power lives at a local entity. Those are really important. And what's the relationship between those three? And when I say power, I mean that in the broadest sense. I don't necessarily mean that it's a zero-sum game, that just because a regional entity takes on a role, that it has to take power away from a regional or state entity. There are some things that need to happen that just don't exist at all right now, and are actually new functions and authorities that need to be carried out, at least if we're going to really do watershed-based planning. And so that's a long-winded answer to the question, but I hope it begins to start to answer it, that right now there are some of these functions that are taking place, but there's no one entity right now that is clearly playing this role. I think this wouldn't be the thorny, big programmatic challenge that's before us if it was already clear that there was one or two entities already doing this work in regions across the state. I think that's partly why we're here, is to wrestle with these really tough questions. And we can learn from other places too. We're not the only ones to have gone through this. So there are other states that have other examples, and we'll continue to provide. And I think, the Watershed Initiative staff at OCD and other state agencies have already provided a bunch of interesting research from other states. And we'll continue to provide those examples. We're here today to talk about Region 7 and what makes sense for Region 7, but there's a lot that can be learned from other places where that have gone through some of these conversations before us.
Yeah, thanks, David. Go ahead, Micah. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I was just going to ask David if you would agree, when you look at the categories of the different kinds of authorities, that we have listed in the guidebook. Those are things that you ideally would want any kind of, an entity that's overseeing, water management or flood management have. And I think those are maybe just kind of a jumping off point for discussion. If you scroll back down, I think, Evelyn, you have it where when you look at the charts where you have, bonding authority, taxation authority, the ability to enforce land use and zoning standards. Those are the kind of things that you might generally want to look at when thinking about what authority does this maybe a new agency or current agency need to have in being able to do this. I mean, isn't that kind of the basis of why we decided to use those things in this particular, in each of our charts?
Yeah, and I think there's a relationship between those two things. So let's say, for instance, that your regional entity did have the ability to carry out projects, but also had the ability, like the example of the Regional Planning Commission with transportation funds, to approve local projects or to fund local projects or to cost share with them, or to run an analysis and determine what regional impacts there were and weigh in on the design of a project. I mean, there's so many different ways in which a project could be influenced by a regional entity. It doesn't necessarily have to be implemented by that entity. It could be just influenced in some way or another. And so the requirement that there be some sort of role for the regional entity in carrying out a project probably needs to be fleshed out in much greater detail than just can they do or can they not do projects, right? It's much more nuanced than that. It's what's their relationship to the funding. It's what's their relationship to the local entity that may be participating in that project also. And then legislatively, does it extend beyond just the program dollars? Could it even be locally? The example that was talked about earlier was only as I heard that actually it was only in response to, federal or state dollars. Well, what if there is the ability to influence projects even when they're locally funded? It's just an open-ended question that I'm, putting out there. That would obviously require legislative authority that doesn't exist for influence.
Yeah, thanks, David and Nika. I think that was a really helpful conversation, and I found myself learning quite a few things. And as always, just going back to, literally one of the functions of this regional steering committee is to begin to create and deliberate on what the build out of that long-term coalition is. So thank y'all for coming and helping to ground us in this tool, this resource that y'all have provided. I think they're really great questions and discussion that are helpful as we think about what are the potential models, the governance models that could be most helpful or useful for our region. I do want to go ahead and move us on. It looks like we need to move into the next part of our agenda. With that being said, if people have further questions, comments, or need to have further discussions, please reach out and we can get y'all in contact, whether it's with David or Nika or somebody with OCD, just kind of depending on what your question is. And we can definitely do a follow-up with that. If you do have questions, I know that we're going to have another conversation with Baker Donaldson about some questions that we have specifically. So just feel free to send those to me at rsanderson@crpcla.org, and we can be sure to pass those along as well. So I'm going to put my name or my email back in the chat box. If you have further questions for them, please send them to me via email and we'll make sure that they get passed on. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. It's within a similar vein of the conversation, but we're going to shift into discussing the potential organizational structure. So, kind of what do I mean when I say potential organizational structure? Like if you think about the flow chart of an organization and kind of how it looks like and the committees, that's really what I'm meaning today for organizational structure. So thinking about the committees, thinking about voting members, we're not going to get as specific as naming individuals, But if we can get as specific as saying, maybe each parish is represented and it should be this particular position, that's kind of what we're working towards in terms of our goal today. And so what we're going to be doing with that information is, once again, and we say this every meeting, I think, but using it to build out what are going to be a couple of different governance models or frameworks that we're going to really bring back to y'all and say, based on what we've heard, these are some of the models that we think might potentially work for Region 7. And so once again, we'll deliberate on those. So the purpose of this section is to discuss the current organizational structure, because it's good to ground back in what we currently have so that we can figure out where we should go. We'll discuss what we've heard to date with regards to the governance structure, so potential roles and functions, for example, and then discussing the potential organizational structure for the governance recommendation itself. We have an activity that I'm going to lean on Evelyn and Dr. Douthit to also provide some facilitation support. So currently what we have is the Regional Steering Committee. So we have 17 total members. 13 of those are parish representatives. We have 13 parishes within our region total, so there's one member who represents each parish. Most of them are staffers. They're engineers and planners, things of that nature. We have 4 regional representatives, so that includes Amite River Basin Commission, Department of Environmental Quality, the Pontchartrain Conservancy, and the Greater Baton Rouge Home Builders Association. So that's what we look like in terms of a voting body right now. We also have the Region 7 coordinating entity, which is Capital Region Planning Commission. So myself, Rachel, and Kim Marasek, we both work at CRPC. So we both charge time to the Watershed Initiative and also have some other support staff who provide some assistance, like GIS folks, for example, or other data individuals. And then we have state coordinating entities. There's the Watershed Council that's not specifically listed on this chart. But we do have the Office of Community Development, who is really managing the community development block grant dollars that are funding this initiative. So they're kind of like the lead on the Watershed Initiative, if you will. And then they work in partnership with other state agencies. We do have model managers, is what I'm kind of referring to them as, which is DOTD. So they manage the contracts and the consultants for modeling. And I also want to note that OCD, DOTD, CRPC, all the acronym soup, we're not represented as voting members on the committee. And I think that makes sense because we're coordinating the work. Feels a little bit too close to be able to vote, if you will. And so going to pause here, see if anybody has questions, and if not, we will transition into what we've heard from y'all in terms of what our needs are for the organizational structure. Thank you, Evelyn, for jumping in on Russell's question. Thank you, thank you. Okay, we'll move to the next slide. And we're going to keep going back to this fantastic network map provided by Dr. Douthit and Lindsay Lamanna. What we've heard so far is that we need to consider our existing relationships. There is a need to connect disparate actors within our network. So how can we really think strategically? Like, Tangipahoa has something really great going on. So just like very big example, has something really incredible going on. So how are we leveraging and supporting them in those efforts while also not duplicating the effort of it, but leveraging it instead? The same could be with any of our Feliciana parishes, EBR, any of our saints, Washington, any parish. So how are we strategically leveraging the tools and resources that we already have? And I think beyond that too, I think we can think about them in terms of our non-government organizations. Some examples of those might be Healthy Gulf. Pontchartrain Conservancy is on our regional steering committee, right? I think funders fit in that. So Baton Rouge Area Foundation, Foundation for Louisiana, North Shore Community Foundation, St. Francisco Foundation. There's quite a few. And we've also heard from y'all, and we really want to ground into this discussion and about our values, right? So we have that guiding principles framework, which is on crpcla.org/about. And what we heard from y'all, as well as other people across Region 7, is that our values include access, culture, and diversity. And so when we say diversity, we mean in terms of life, who you are as a person, what your beliefs are, what your race, ethnicity, age, gender identity, things of those nature. So diversity in terms of life, a diversity in terms of your life experience and what you have witnessed, because everybody is the expert of their own life, right? We also heard the need for diversity of occupation. So how do we get our community-based organizers in the same room as planners, as engineers, as modelers, to have conversations? And we think that by living through our values, we can achieve some of the other values that we've put forward. And one of those is, when we have kind of the access, the diversity, and the culture as a part of grounding in the build out of our organizational structure, then we can lead to advocating for more equitable outcomes. And when we're doing that, then we actually start to build creativity and innovation into what we're doing, which means that we're really working towards a shared destiny. So thinking about how our efforts can support one another through a community that we're building over time, rather than thinking strategically about, rather than doing things that may sometimes be unintentionally harmful. Because I think that's what we're kind of working from here, is that we're not intentionally causing harm by our land use planning and decisions. Things just happen, and we're trying to do what we need to do in our municipality, parishes, regions. So how are we working towards this shared destiny? So keeping these values in mind as we think about that structure. We've also heard that there's a need to really connect beyond engineers and planners. Y'all are engineers and planners have been the backbone of this conversation and are necessary to the conversation. And what we've also heard is that there's a need to connect to our doers and frontline communities. So you can think of those folks as your practitioners, frontline communities. Those are folks who are living and experiencing this every day. Sometimes those people fall in the same bucket, right? But this might be your really concerned resident who keeps coming to meetings, who shows up with resources, who wants a bigger role, but they just don't, they're not either being, there's not the opportunity for them to engage in a bigger role, or maybe that connection hasn't been made. So these folks kind of help provide a reality check, and they're really good at describing their succinct needs from that particular level. You have folks who are designers and dreamers, and based on the needs that are being communicated by the folks who are experiencing those challenges, can say, here's 8 different ways to solve this problem. Here's how we can get creative about it. Here's how we can leverage other tools, other resources, other funding mechanisms even. It's really getting those folks to kind of talk to each other. And then also our explorers. These are our researchers. These are the folks who get excited about reading and looking at the research and diving into really saying, okay, these are the challenges that we're seeing in our region. How does that fit in terms of a pattern? How are we shifting the pattern in the way that we are making decisions, in the ways that we are really thinking strategically about working to solve our challenges and working to get to those more equitable outcomes and working towards creativity and innovation, so that on this path for a shared destiny, we are really taking care of one another and thinking strategically. I'm going to keep using that word strategically about how we're integrating all these components. And then, synthesizing that information back into who the voting members of this body look like. Some of those folks might be across these different categories. I don't know. That's what we're here to discuss today. But what does an organizational structure that leverages the necessary groups look like for us? In terms of potential functions, we've heard quite a few things. So we've heard from y'all that we want this to be a hub to weave networks, to manage partnerships, to incentivize coordination and collaboration, offer outreach and engagement. We've also heard, and I think on this call today too, to offer consistency, to establish the mission and vision for the region, to be able to provide regional best practices, including decision-making with a local context, to be locally sensitive within that as well. And then technical support, and this phrase might change over time, but what that means today is model maintenance and development, technical assistance to be able to use the models, to be able to do GIS or mapping, things of that nature. And then those larger projects, which we just had a conversation about. So we really want y'all to think about who should make up the membership of the future governance structure. What kind of additional support and technical expertise do they need to be successful in the decisions that they're making, and who is missing from this conversation too? And so what we're going to do, I'm going to actually exit out of this slide, is we are going to discuss just that through a board activity, which we're excited to be able to present with y'all through a tool called Miro, M-I-R-O, excuse me. So a couple of different steps. The first is we are going to focus in on building out that kind of organizational flow chart. So what is a manageable size for a coalition or a committee? What does parish representation look like? What does regional representation look like? How are we also thinking about within that organizational structure, how we can strategically leverage other activities through who is a voting member, ex officio, committees, like whatever the buckets end up being, and also thinking about our relationships in Mississippi and state and federal entities as well. Then we're going to have an exercise where we're sorting folks into buckets. I don't even know which ones I'm pulling right now, so don't think that I'm putting those folks into those buckets specifically, but moving these entities into the buckets of those doers and frontline communities, the designers and dreamers, the explorers, and who we think might make sense as voting members. Once again, we're not getting explicit on names here. We are talking organizations and perhaps positions. And then we'll talk about who's missing and how do we fill in the gaps. So the goal is not to put every single sticky note into a box, because some people might not fit into one of those boxes, right? And if they don't, then that's an opportunity for us to really think strategically about, you know, is there another role for them? What is our relationship with that organization? So I'm going to pause for just a moment, check the chat box, see if we have any questions. Does anybody have any questions about what we're doing? Are we okay? Okay. Well, I'm not hearing any. So we will go ahead and.
Good, just one more time. There's this map on the left, and then there are the three boxes.
Yeah.
So it was the box, and so maybe we could just go over again how they interrelate.
Sure. So this little mind map, I guess we'll call it, is where we'll kind of start to build out that structure, so the flow chart, if you will. So what is a manageable size in terms of the coalition? What does regional representation, parish representation look like based on y'all's thoughts? How that interrelates with this group is that we're kind of discussing, I think, more of exploring voting membership within the mind map. We are thinking about what our relationship could look like with some other folks. And in exercise, like step 2 of this exercise, we are then being explicit about kind of, I think that maybe this organization that we think that needs to be a part of this conversation kind of fits into this box. And then this can help us think about, okay, maybe longer term, this means that we need committees, or maybe longer term, we need ex officio members, or maybe actually because this organization plays a more substantial role, they should be a voting member. So this is to help us think about what that organizational structure looks like. And then the last thing is really addressing just, there are going to be some of these sticky notes that are still in this box, and that's okay. We may be actually missing some folks too, so it's also time to have that discussion. Okay, is that helpful, Tom?
Yeah, and I guess I'd just say, we talked about this, just some things to consider is, and also to address a comment by, another comment by Mr. Bankston, which is how do you get a structure until you determine authority? I think that your discussion today and going forward about what are the functions you'd like your organization to have in theory, what is its structure, is gonna determine, I think, and think about it in the context of, well, in order for what we're hoping our capabilities are gonna be, who really needs to be involved and what authorities are they gonna need to have? And so I think that's a good thing to consider as you're going through this with Rachel.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So we will go
I have
ahead
one quick
and,
thing.
yeah, sure, Chuck.
So if this question was easy to answer, it would have been solved a long time ago. So as we're going through this, think about what you want. Think about what's best and how to make the best decisions. And don't let the current constraints limit you in any way, whether it's laws or organizational structures or anything, because those may be the limiting factors in some cases.
Yeah, that's a really good thing to
And
ground in.
I'll just say, I keep hearing, from people outside the state is, man, what y'all are doing is monumental and amazing. And it's a huge effort, and it is. And just don't think that just what you're hearing on this regional steering committee call is everything. There's many different groups that have been working on this for at least, I've been involved since June of 2018. So, and I know it was started before that. So there's a lot of moving parts to this, a lot of things that are being considered and looked at that haven't really been discussed openly on this call, because our purpose is to lay out what some project ideas and to determine a governance structure.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. Don't be afraid to think outside of the box here, y'all. I think that's a really good message to push forward here. What do we want our future state to be? I think David asked this earlier. So I think maybe a question, considering our potential functions, considering our values that we have, how do we want to build out an example of an organizational structure? And maybe one of the easier questions to start with is, what would a manageable size be? Right now we have 17 members. Does that seem like a okay size? Do we want to revisit this after we talk about the representation? And this might be where I start to implement our round robin, y'all, so be ready.
I would
think
just
it's an important thing to start off with.
And I would just pipe into one, also consider that one characteristic of many watershed organizations is oftentimes with a nested structure. To understand that there might be, is there a larger group that also contemplates maybe HUC 8 groups or even HUC 10 or HUC 12 groups, and how to understand that it doesn't necessarily have to be within a watershed organization, just a single board, and that's everything.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. So in terms of manageable size, is 17. So we have 17, remember, because we have 13 parishes in our region. And then we have 4 regional representatives. So Chuck, for example, is one of our regional representatives. What do y'all consider to be too big of a group and perhaps too small in terms of size for voting members specifically? I'm gonna start round robin. Chuck, you're first on my list. You have any thoughts?
Well, 17 seems so far like a pretty good number. One of my options I thought of was kind of mirroring the structure of this group as it is. But if we're talking about getting, maybe some state representatives involved or some other representation as a voting member, then we may need to alter that a little bit. I think something like 5 is too small.
Rachel, Bridget.
Hey,
I would
Bridget.
think that we may need to really explore who's missing and who we need as other representatives to give us, guidance, feedback for inclusion first before we box ourselves in to figure out how many members should or do we need for voting in that respect. I understand that from the political subsidies, parish representatives are there. We've got 13 of those, and then there's those at large, if you will. But I also saw in Tom's presentation when they were doing the vetting of some of the other agencies, there's numerous, drainage districts, more than one per parish that's there, that we may want to have that represented as well, and maybe not every board or every, least recognized gravity drainage district have a representative there, but maybe collectively among themselves, they have one that would be, a person on the board or on the coalition with voting rights, if you will. So I think until we really know, number one, who we have and who we don't have and who else is missing, to try and figure out how many members we would really need for cohesiveness and for collaboration, we may be boxing ourselves in too small. And if we go ahead and set that number right now without knowing this information, then trying to, promote other groups to get involved and become active, you're going to say, what's the point? I don't really have a vote. I don't have a place at the table per se. I wouldn't want us to put the horse before the cart.
Yeah, I think.
Well, I don't think it's a limiting factor right now. I think, certainly there's a number of which would be too many to manage, but I don't know what that number is. But I think if we have a number now, it just gives us an idea to talk around, and it's not really setting a limit. It may go a little higher than that. And I suspect that it will, but I do think that's part of, I laid out two options. One was more like what she hinted to there. The other was more to be reflective of the regional steering committee. But the other was to be, maybe we have 4 or 5 parish reps, several representatives for industry, several representatives for drainage districts and things of that nature, several that represent groups like ARBC and others, and again, you can't have everybody be a member, but they will have representation.
Hey, Rachel, to speak to Chuck's point a little bit, usually when you get to groups that are over 25 and you're talking about voting, that can get a little bit unmanageable. And also you might not necessarily get the minimum number. I'm assuming you guys are going to establish a quorum number. And when you have these really large groups, sometimes it's hard to get the quorum that equals the right percentage of your group. So I think just for the sake of discussion, I would maybe just start the conversation around 20, 21, 22, something like that, and see if that gets us close to what we want for representation, and maybe we go up or down a little bit. But we found that's a pretty manageable number for getting geographic diversity, but also getting a decent sized quorum to show up.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing to think about. Thank you, Robert. And, I think within that too, what I'm kind of hearing is that maybe there were, on the voting membership, and perhaps if there are committees, those can be kind of two different things. So then thinking about how are we strategically also leveraging other bodies that might be needed to support for technical assistance or providing further information to help the voting body make decisions, I think, is a way that we can manage that too. But I think
that sounds like, I think I'm in agreement with you there, because that's kind of something I was thinking about, is that there might be a certain group of them that are not voting members, but more like advisors. And I do think, we need some citizen representation in there.
And one thing to consider and weigh, I think, in an area such as here that involves multiple parishes, cities and watershed is the possibility of a group that sets broad goals and broader policy versus whether some things regarding some specific project level discussions maybe should be contemplated and delegated at different scales, and also how to consider different technical, as you're saying, components. And so what do you want to have in your large region-wide committee, if you want to have a large region-wide committee, versus what might you be able to create smaller working bodies, maybe with drainage districts, or I'm not trying to use that as an example, but maybe in the HUCs, HUC 8 or 10s where they are. And also, if you're concerned about bringing in technical knowledge, is that the same as setting these sort of broader region-wide goals?
So are you talking about having one large coalition divided into sort of sub-coalitions?
Well, I mean, I think that these are all things that you guys should maybe consider. For example, thinking about the idea of if there's going to be a review of plans, and if they're conceived at, let's say, a HUC 8 level, would the body that reviews that, would you really want one single body for the region, or would they be different ones? There are trade-offs in any of those decisions that you make, but those are just sort of considerations about what the functions are. What is best scaled up regionally? I don't know, maybe managing with one sort of computer infrastructure, data models, but maybe other things where there are more region-specific, context-specific decisions. Maybe delegation down might, in a nested structure, might make sense.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So, what I'm kind of hearing from that is perhaps if there are working groups or advisory committees, they should really fit the need based on what the determined functions are. So that's what I'm interpreting from what you're saying. So what we're hearing so far is there's some parish representation. 5 is too small. 22 people might kind of be a cap. Folks that are missing gravity drainage district citizen representation, I'm going to go ahead and put industry in here as well. So I think I want to ask, let me see who's next on my list for round robin. Ross, do you have any thoughts in terms of the voting body? Like, what is regional representation? And I think also, what is our relationship with Mississippi? Because we share a lot of our watershed basins with them. And what's our relationship with state and federal entities? I'm going to pitch it to Ross first, if you have any thoughts.
Rachel, I'm having some bad technical difficulties today, so I'm just going to pass on that and try and listen as much as I can.
Sure. I'm sorry, Ross. I did not realize that. If you need to follow up, just give me a call and we'll chat about it. Bobby Joe, do you have any thoughts? If you're still on the line, or maybe Alex. I think Alex might have joined us too.
As y'all join in to give some answers while we're in this part of the exercise, maybe it would be helpful when you say an answer about, for example, how many maybe should be on the coalition or on this committee. Can you kind of frame it in terms of what you see as their purview, and that's why you're saying that number? I think that might be helpful. I know we've been discussing that kind of as a through line, but I think that might help kind of inform the group about where you're coming from.
Thanks, Evelyn.
This is Bridget again, and I'll extrapolate on what some of the others have already kind of shared and brought forward. Is I sort of see us having, when it comes to voting and needing having reasons to vote and have a decision made, that number being no more than 20, obviously. I think we've kind of already got that up there, but 20 or less. But I really do see having it structured, as others have referenced and mentioned, maybe even subcommittees, if you would, based off of maybe HUC 10 or 12 levels that would be smaller than HUC 8. And those groups kind of knowing what the impact is and what their best practices are they want for those particular watersheds. But that collectively, anyone that would be part of any subcommittee or sub watershed, if you would, of the HUC 10 or 12 would be a coalition member. But I envision the voting body of this being something recognized of that 20 or less people as what I would say is maybe an executive board that would have voting rights. So you may have numerous coalition members because they really do need a seat at the table to talk about what's happening in their area and how these best practices will impact how they do business from day to day. And we want their buy-in and their feedback. We want them to have that voice. But I think ultimately those groups, subgroups, if you will, subcommittee groups, however you want to call it, but again, it's just part of the full coalition for the region, would at some point elect one or two, or however you want to differentiate this, a member from that collective group to be their voting member on what I would call the executive board. And the executive board members could rotate annually, however you want to write up the bylaws in that respect. And again, you'd have to include what the bylaws would say about what constitutes a quorum. You know, is it going to be, you have 20 members, then you've got to have basically 11 present to vote and for something to pass. So it's 50 plus 1 or whatever. But that would be, in my opinion, lined out based off of what we put in the bylaws for how the coalition itself would be structured and governed. And then I envision, I don't care if you call it an executive board, advisory council, whatever it might be, that would have the voting rights as they're elected by their subgroups collectively.
Thanks, Bridget. That's a really helpful explanation. So if I'm envisioning this right, I'm going to repeat it back, is that there's essentially subcommittees that are based on perhaps smaller watershed levels or needs, and then they select who their coalition members are by vote. And that would perhaps be an executive board with voting rights. That's kind of capped at maybe perhaps at 20 people type of a range. And so it's really like providing a little bit more of a democratic process to that selection too, I think. And I think within that as well, something that I'm curious about is what, you know, one of our values is creating more equitable outcomes. So do we think that having a membership body that also supports these subcommittees, that allows for those subcommittees to then vote for the representative member, does that fit in alignment with our values too?
Are you asking the group at large, or are you?
Good question, Bridget. Anybody who wants to answer.
I'll speak one just for clarity on my part. I think that you can still keep that in the same point of reference. And again, if we're saying 20, it could be plus or minus a few of those, 2022. If you've got 13 parishes, I say maybe you have a representative for the parishes. And then that gives you 7 if you were to go at 20. That's 7 other representatives. And depending on how we want to identify these HUCs, if it's 8 or 10 or whichever, then maybe a representative per watershed river body, if you will, could be the at large from that perspective. And that may also dictate or differentiate how many subcommittees or subgroups you have, because it could basically be off of whatever watershed and whatever public and political entities are affected by X watershed level would be a subcommittee that everyone needs to be at the table to talk and come up with their own plans of action or best course of action type thing. And I think if we keep that as our point of reference and keep that in mind.
Hello, we are calling you because you are eligible for student loan forgiveness.
Input and community individualism and that cultural aspect that we are trying to make sure that we are mindful of if we do it in such a way, and still have that guaranteed.
Hey, this is Sandra.
Sorry about that, Bridget. Can you repeat that last part? So
Trying to read what you put, so I don't know where you left off.
sorry. I wanted to find that individual. I muted them with love. I'm sorry. We just couldn't hear Bridget.
That's okay. I was just saying that, you know, if we had that 20 or so number of members, you've got 13 that are parishes, so a representative from each parish, and then that leaves you 7, or give or take, for watershed level representatives. Because if you're gonna have your sub watersheds, then maybe it's per river. You've got the Tickfaw River, you've got the Bayou Liberty, Maurepas watershed. So if you're looking at the sub watersheds, each one of those would have a representative collectively. And maybe your subcommittees would be formed based off of those sub watersheds on a local regional basis. And those are going to also drive your cultural competency and the collaboration for community engagement and involvement, because it is personal to them, because it's where they live and work.
And I think we have 8 Huck 8s in our region. Consider similarity in those numbers.
I missed that part.
Well,
is that how many?
8 Huck 8s in the region.
Okay, well, based off of my numbers, then that would be 21. So you'd have an odd number for you to be able to do quorums and so on as well. But that was my thought. Then it is stratified based off of political subsidies, the parishes, and then of course the 8 watersheds that are there have a general representative as well.
Bridget, I think that's
and we can play with. Go ahead.
A really interesting articulation. One question that came to my mind when you were, that creative vision you had. How do you imagine that people will be appointed by parishes? Would they be just a representative from the parish as we have on the committee now, or would you envision this as them being sort of appointed or nominated by the parish governments themselves?
I think it could be either of those 2 ways. It could be appointed, or it could be based off of office representation as those parishes have it. What I really look for is, okay, you're saying there's 8 sub, Huck 8s. So we have 8 of those. Well, I can tell you personally, from my perspective, we've got probably 4 or 5 staff members that work on drainage issues just within parish government, and then the other outside agencies, our different drainage districts that we work with. When we're talking about a collective project that's going to impact, flood reduction and improve drainage across the board. So if we're looking at something that, in my opinion, is going to affect a certain watershed, then why would we not want to expand our reach and invite any other agencies that have their staff that, to the table? And it might be 2 or 3 or 4 different people from each parish, because you're going to have your parish engineer, you're going to maybe have drainage district administrator, you're going to have your floodplain manager that isn't the parish engineer, that really have a role in having some insight and some responsibilities for ensuring safety collectively for these aspects of these projects. So you're not going to have a person as a parish. You really need that team that works together from a parish to come together to talk about the impacts of what their projects may be or may come about that will affect their neighbors on either side or north or south of them. And everyone in the same room kind of collaborating together. And then from that group, the parish themselves may have to delegate or dictate who their representative is, but collectively from that one watershed and everyone else that's in the room, that group can figure out who they would like to be their watershed voted representative. Those 8 members, those 8 people, because it's going to be the people that are all together talking about what best results are, how they want best practices, or moving forward for growth or for changes to prevent or to improve flood protection for that particular watershed.
That's really helpful, Bridget. I think I'll probably follow up with you in an offline conversation to get some more thoughts, because I think you've spent quite a bit of time talking about this. And if other folks want to do this as well, we can do that. But I think you have almost built out potentially like at least one part of the organizational structure framework just from this like short conversation. So if I can pick your brain later, Bridget, that would be much appreciated.
I answer Tom's question.
Do what?
I said, I hope I answered Tom's question. I'm sorry, I was talking too fast for you to type it, but I was trying to answer his question as to how I sort of envisioned that.
Yeah, I think you did fabulous. It was really, really helpful. It's a lot of really great information for us to think about and consider. And so I feel like we have an idea at least of maybe a couple of different ways that the voting membership could look like potentially. Or at least I feel that way. I don't know, Evelyn and Tom, if y'all are okay to move on to the next box exercise and we can get a little bit deeper into kind of the who. You can give me a thumbs up or verbal.
I would love to hear just from the group if anyone has any immediate responses kind of to what we've just laid out here. It sounded like, you know, in what Bridget kind of threw at the board here, I think she's getting at a coalition that deals a lot with projects, right? Specifically those that may impact multiple Huck 10s or 12s. That's kind of what I'm hearing, right? Is that when we're talking about projects, it's clear that some alignment needs to go from the smaller area to the larger region, right? And so I'm wondering, did anyone have a reaction to that proposition?
I think we need to, maybe if we can come out of today and have a couple of 2 or 3 or whatever it is, major frameworks to look at and consider, I think that would be helpful. And then comment on, edit, and so forth. At least for me, because I'm hearing a lot of good things, but I can't really evaluate them.
I hear you, Chuck, and we'll get that on our end. We might not have those in totality until the December meeting, but we're definitely going to have that, and we'll be working with Tom and Evelyn and some other folks too to kind of talk about what we see at least as trade-offs to deliberate between those to help prompt some discussion. So it's definitely where we're headed, because it's a lot to think about if you don't have the things to compare and contrast, if you will. And I think what I was hearing from Bridget too, and maybe I was extrapolating, so if I was, Bridget, please clarify, but that also, you know, this entity would fill some of these other potential functions, so could actually be used for like outreach and education. I'm kind of thinking about that in terms of like programmatic activities, and also providing the regional best practices, things of that nature. Just the function kind of works through those committees and then up to the exec board. Okay. Well, thank y'all. We have about 15 minutes left in this exercise, I do believe. So we will transition on to the, go ahead.
There were a couple comments in the text, I think. One from Mr. Kelly and one from Honora Burris.
Got it. I captured Honora's. Let me copy Russell's into here as well. I think that fits under the what's missing category. And I had environmental community. Okay, thank you, Tom. Wasn't trying to miss that. Okay, so within this, we have some folks laid out that have been identified through various discussions or that we know of that does this work, and it's a really wide-ranging group of folks who do this work. And so I guess what we want to ask this group is, you know, do we want to identify some of these folks who you know, our doers and frontline communities. Once again, they're the reality check. They kind of help establish our needs as folks who can act as problem solvers to help us really think strategically about this, as folks who are researchers, and as folks who might be voting members. So I'm going to kind of zoom out here and maybe list off a couple of organizations, or if somebody sees one on the board and they're like, I think this organization fits into this box and this is why, we can go ahead and do that. So trying to zoom in enough to where you can see all of them and it's also not too small. So I'm gonna call on somebody. Earl, you're next on my list. Do any of these folks on here strike you as, you know, fitting into one of these boxes that we think we should engage with?
Hold on, I'm working off my phone, so I got it. Takes me a
Let
second.
me list some out. I can list some out too.
Give me a
Okay. Thanks, Earl.
I'm looking for.
And if
Rachel,
we
what-
don't have them, we can make a Post-it note.
Nah, keep going. I'm thinking.
Okay, we'll come back to you. What about you, Gary or Karen? Do y'all have any thoughts about kind of what, if we want to engage with some of these organizations, and if so, what the role in engaging might be?
I don't see anything really jumps out at me now.
Hey, this is Earl. Did I miss it earlier, or is DOTD their sort of, yeah, DOTD, because of their work in floodplain management, I think you need to include them.
Okay. Do you want to consider those folks to maybe be in our doers and frontline communities, like our practitioner box, or what are you thinking, Earl?
Probably practitioner, yes.
Okay. Thanks, Earl. What about, I'm going to throw a couple out here. Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority East. Does anybody have any thoughts about those folks and the work that they do with regards to the need to work with them? Or perhaps St. Tammany Levee Drainage Conservation District. You got any thoughts, Ross?
I would definitely think they need to be included somewhere on that left side.
I think maybe practitioners again.
I'm curious to know y'all in answering some of these questions. If anyone has an experience they want to share in maybe working with one of these groups to like plan and execute a project, or supporting each other in some sort of outreach effort, you know, sometimes that helps to kind of think through what do we mean when we're putting these things in categories.
Hi guys, this is Nika. I used to be the executive counsel for the Southeast Flood Authority, east side of the river. And I do know that they obviously do a lot of flood protection work. And they also operate the 3 main pump stations along Lakeshore Drive. They do a lot of collaborative work with the City of New Orleans and the Corps of Engineers. And they also build projects for flood protection, both mitigation and new projects. So just I have worked with them in the past, and I do know that they predominantly is all they do is flood protection and water management stuff. So they do know what they're doing in that respect.
Thanks, Nika. We'll gather them into our practitioner box. So it sounds like. What about our housing folks? I think there's oftentimes within this conversation, what comes up is is the fact that our flood challenges overlap so much with housing, especially in Region 7. So I think some folks that are on here, Build Baton Rouge, Housing Louisiana, of course, Greater Baton Rouge, Home Builders Association, which Karen is with, North Shore Home Builders Association. Do we have any thoughts about what it might look like to call in our housing experts into the space? And maybe Karen, if you have thoughts, since that's kind of your wheelhouse.
Rachel, can you scroll over to the left of the screen and down a little so we can see those titles again?
Oh, wait, you mean here?
No, over to the left where the four boxes. We can't see the title.
Sorry. Here we go. Make sure. Well, Karen, do you have any thoughts, or do we still have Ronnie on the phone? I know sometimes we talk about housing on North Shore.
You talking to me, Ronnie Carter?
Yeah, just if there are any folks who kind of do work within the housing arena, so Build Baton Rouge, Housing Louisiana, Greater Baton Rouge Home Builders Association, those are examples. If we think engaging with them is something that needs to happen, I would
engaging with any of the home builder organizations, even the real estate people, would be a major plus. They're the ones that actually profit from all of our good work, actually. I tell the home builder organizations all the time that they're the ones that really should be pushing water quality, because when they sell a property next to a clean water body, that property value is greatly improved. So yeah, the home builder organizations, and they're actually it's a pretty big organization, and there's some folks in there that are pretty interested in the work that we do. Very interested, because they do profit from it.
Yeah, I think that's a good connection there to point out, Ronnie. Our flood risk and water quality are inherently connected back to our real estate values.
Right.
Is there a specific real estate, maybe organization or group that you might recommend tapping into?
Probably each parish has their own, I would think. I'm sure there's one here in Tangipahoa Parish. We did a class here once for home builder organizations, and we had well over 100 participants. So it's a pretty active and big group, and they're interested in this kind of stuff. If we would just contact them, I think that they would be glad to come in and work with us.
There's the North Shore Home Builders.
Yeah, North Shore Home Builders Association.
I might be reaching out to you and Karen for some connections, if that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is Jamie Setz, Executive Director of CRPC. I just want you to know, Ronnie, that we had 17 slots available for this steering committee. And so because we're based out of Baton Rouge, that's why I reached out to Karen Zito and not the North Shore Home Builders to actually be on the steering committee.
Thanks, Jamie. That's helpful contextual information. Some other folks that are on here is Center for Planning Excellence, Foundation for Louisiana, Land Trust for Louisiana, National Wildlife Federation. Do any of those strike y'all as groups that we need to be in conversation with? We haven't
You
heard
know, I
from
heard-
Steve Kistler. Go ahead.
I heard, just keep this in mind as y'all answer, I heard references in the exercise just prior to this of needing kind of advisory groups, right? Citizen advisors, expert advisors. I wonder if some of these organizations fill that role, right, for some of what I'm hearing described. Y'all go ahead though.
What about Mike Inlow or Steve Kistler? We haven't heard from y'all today.
This is Steve Kistler. The groups that you mentioned, I'm not familiar enough to know exactly what their expertise are, but I did notice a tile for the private engineering firms. I think their expertise would be needed under the designer and dreamers.
Thanks, Steve. Are there any particular firms that you want to recognize?
Well, we have several here local, and obviously that would be popular. But no, I don't know about enough of the reputations of firms of the other 13 or the other 12 parishes. So I know I can toot the horns here, but that may not be fair.
I appreciate that, Steve. Thank you. Thank you for recognizing the need to be fair in that discussion. I really appreciate that. Let me see if I'm not missing something in the chat box. Wait, hang on a second. Realistic and safe building elevations and retention areas. Some may be developer friendly versus flood retention friendly. Planning commissions are local government. Being a part of this, and I think yes, we have mentioned the need for there to be parish representation. I'm going to go ahead and make another sticky, for planning commissions. Okay, and then we are going to, shift gears just for a couple of minutes and talk about, is there anybody that stands out in anybody's mind where we haven't had a discussion about them yet? There are a lot of Post-it notes left on this board. So what we're going to do is kind of go back to the drawing board and brainstorm a little bit about what each of these organizations do, so that we can provide that information whenever we think about the larger build out of the structure. Is there anybody missing, or are there any organizations that y'all want to shout out specifically, or agencies?
This is Larry. I don't know how you cannot have. This is Larry. I don't know how you cannot have the Amite River Basin Commission on here.
Larry, that's a great point, and I'm glad that you bring that up. Y'all are right here. Where do you want to put your organization?
A member, but also I think y'all need to understand where the commission is right now. There are how we're set up. There's 2 from each parish and 1 at large. There are 13 members from all the different parishes that are included. And that is the mechanism. And I agree with Bridget. I think that everything needs to be on a HUC basis, that is for the size of it. But the question that I have is when you start dividing, and let's get down to the hog killing, when they start dividing up the money, are you going to have people from St. Tammany voting on things for East Baton Rouge Parish? That's the question I have. Or are we just going to look at each individual HUC?
Well, and I think as our alternate member for Amite River Basin Commission, that's a question for the whole group. That's what y'all are here to deliberate. I don't know if anybody has any initial responses to that, so I'll open the floor.
So I don't know how the money is going to be divided up. I do know that as far as round 1, there was a set of criteria that by which the projects are evaluated. And I'm guessing it may be the same for round 2, but I don't know that it's going to be, say, divided up per se, you know?
Larry, I'm just joining in because we're talking about round 1. Just want to make sure I'm, here as needed to answer questions on that. I mean, Larry, I'm hearing your question speak more to the long-term operation of the coalition, which isn't necessarily specific to any one, you know, funding mechanism, right? It's not specific to round one. It's more about how do you guys make decisions together over the next decades, right? And so when I hear your question about how does the money get divided up, I think that's a formational question for this group, right? Like, how do you want to decide to do projects together or separately, you know?
But you hit it right, nail on the head. The question ends up being, there may be one project that is so overwhelmingly, and you get down to look at way the Corps of Engineers look at it. The Corps of Engineers look at it based upon a cost benefit analysis. There may be one project in our Florida parishes that is so overwhelmingly beneficial. Do we adopt something like the Corps has, which requires there to be an analysis of a cost benefit ratio? Or do we simply say we have 8 different HUCs, we get $1 million each, and that's how we divide the money out? I don't think that's the way we should, but that's what I'm just raising that point.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point to raise, Larry. Thank you for bringing that question into space. It's going to be something that we're going to continue to deliberate as a group. You know, and I know that's not satisfactory, right? That's unsatisfying, but we're making a lot of decisions with a lot of uncertainty, and we're going to continue to have to do so because I might be a meteorologist, but I cannot predict the future, which is a little bit incongruent, I think, with popular opinion. We do need to move on. Sorry, is there somebody trying to talk? I'm sorry if I'm cutting you off. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to comment that when you think about that, you know, there can be many ways you can structure these, where you could have a top level regional policy, and then there'd be some sort of consistency agreement with the different different scales depending on how they're divided, 8, 10, 12. You could also have a situation where money is coming also to different agents within the coalition, and there's coordination around that. I'm not sure, maybe Evelyn could answer this. Is there a situation where there would just be a single allocation to the region for HUD funding, or that all be based on different types of equations? I think it's useful to think about, okay, well, how might, in the long run, might money be flowing into the coalition and through what channels, and what, will there ever really be a scenario where there's just a block of money for everywhere, in that way?
That's a great point, and this is like
Rachel,
a perfect segue. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Chuck.
Can we go back quickly to the previous slide?
Sure can.
I was just going to say, I'm glad we're kind of talking through that, because I think one of the hardest challenges that these coalitions are kind of wanting to address, right, is that a lot of grant funds really aren't just a set aside for a geographic region, right? They usually have a lot of strings attached, and a lot of kind of different things you have to prove, and you can fund these types of activities, but not others. I mean, y'all know, HUD funds, of course, have their own particular ways that you can spend them and ways that you can't spend them. And one thing I've heard kind of across the state in all the different regions is, we might have grant funds coming in to build X, Y, or Z, but if we're not coordinating with everyone who has to operate and maintain whatever we're building, then it's not about do we have grant money or not. It's really about, can we even protect our investment long term, which is something that really the locals or the entity that built that infrastructure, oftentimes that falls to them. And that's a really tough question. So I would just encourage y'all, think about what kind of, funds you may have available as a group. but also think about who gets stuck with the cost, right? And how that works in real life, you know, not just, you know, can we get money to do what we want today, but can we take care of it?
So I was going to say that I do think DQ, CPRA, and LDWF should be in one of those boxes over there. I'm not sure exactly where. I can just say from DEQ perspective is that we do a lot of projects make their way around to us to review, and they end up having significant adverse impacts. I like to see that change on the front end.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And you know, I think
Because
also
one thing, and I've said it before, and I said it before, I'll say it again, whatever you do to the water body has an impact to the water quality. And then if you start restricting or reducing the water quality, the parish is going to pay for it long-term, and they don't even realize it because it gets harder and harder to get new water discharge permits, which come from DEQ. The water body gets listed as impaired for dissolved oxygen, then you'll be dealing with other issues long-term.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. Thanks for weaving that back into our patchwork quilt, right? Like that's kind of what we're thinking about here is what are the different roles that exist. And I just wanted to point out that what I'm also, I think there's sometimes spent talking about projects, but a lot of these conversations are also centered back around what are the programmatic efforts? In other words, what is the level of training that can be provided or offered? What is the amount of technical assistance and expertise, which is also a different type of a program that can be offered to support the efforts that are already underway so that we are once again working towards that shared destiny, which is one of our values. And it's also thinking about longer term policy implications. This might not be a group that has authority, but what are the policies that we can have as an organization, as a structure, whether or not that's a new one or an existing one that we're going to retrofit, that actually support regional collaboration and coordination in a way that is strategic so that we are working as a community. So I just wanted to ground back in that. Once again, beyond projects, beyond technical expertise, we are also working to build a structure that provides leveraging abilities to support one another throughout this. So we're going to shift really quick and we're going to kind of fly through this. Y'all in your meeting packet have these tables. I'm going to see if I can find that link really quick and just paste it one more time. So in your meeting packet, you have these tables. I'm going to paste it again. There are a few different funding mechanisms. This is not a holistic list. It is brought to you by Headwaters Economics. That makes it sound like a commercial. We do not endorse them. They did not pay me to say that. It's just a good resource. So there's different types of funding mechanisms. The first, which I think people are familiar with, are local revenue. So what you'll see here is in the furthest left-hand column is the name of the funding source, kind of amount in terms of dollar range. You'll see an example. And you'll see benefits and challenges. So one example is shared costs and joint agreements, which benefits are noted as pluses. So a benefit of that is that it spreads cost amongst partners. Adding partners can increase funding and capacity. And then a challenge with that is that collaborative processes, as we know, because we are engaged in one right now, it can be time consuming, but they're also very beneficial and worth it, at least from my perspective. I learn a lot from our conversations together. There are also private and philanthropic funding mechanisms. So speaking from my experience in Foundations of Louisiana, community and corporate foundations, we have quite a few across the greater Baton Rouge area in Louisiana. So Foundation for Louisiana, Baton Rouge Area Foundation, St. Francisville Foundation, JP Morgan does funding here, Certina does funding here, Kresge, Rockefeller. There are a lot of folks who are in that funding world, if you will. Those are grants. They are highly competitive. Usually it requires a relationship if there's not a request for proposals, but the processes themselves can be challenging. So that's just one example. You'll see the other two that are listed on the slide here. For the sake of time, we're not going to explain all of those. Federal grants and loans, we are skipping the state level for sake of time today. So we do, I think the one that in today's discussion, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, that's who's providing the funds for this initial process, community development block grant dollars, right? That's why we're here. That's why we're able to coordinate and to collaborate in this space, is because CDBG dollars were given to the state of Louisiana. In terms of benefits, they have a lot more resources, so they are good for larger scale projects. They come with a higher investment, if you will. Some of those are low interest loans, but CDBG dollars, that's money that doesn't have to be paid back, which is fantastic news for a state like Louisiana in particular. They are really competitive though. Local match is sometimes required. And the applications, if y'all did not read through the action plan, that document is massive and a lot of time and thought went into it. So it's a time consuming application and the reporting requirements are very stringent because they're federal dollars. So it makes sense. People want to know where their money's going and what it's being used for, if you will. So we're gonna skip this slide. Is that okay, Tom, if we skip this slide for the sake of time?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. This PowerPoint will be online, y'all, and we always send it in an email to all of the regional steering committee members after as an attachment. But crpcla.org/previous events. It might take us a couple of days to get it posted, but the recording and the PowerPoint presentation itself will be online. We're going to do a couple of quick polls. The polls are not meant for discussion, but really as we think about our November 19th discussion, and this was actually an idea that Chuck and Ross had, was to kind of get a feel for what is some information that might be helpful to this group and what might be information that we need to ask from y'all so that we can better inform the conversation in our next meeting. So Evelyn, can you pull up our first poll for question 1? And if our regional steering committee members, if you can answer this poll question, what resources do we have to fund the work of the coalition, or what resource needs do we have to fund the work of the coalition? And so I think a couple of these have been brought up. So maybe perhaps the ability to grant funds to parishes, municipalities, and or other organizations, the ability to fund projects, the ability to fund programs and planning, ability to fund operations and maintenance, unsure, which is okay if you're not sure. None of the above is also okay if you answer that. If you do answer that, I hope that you select other as well, and you can select multiple. And if you do select other, please state your addition in the chat pod just so that we can be aware of that. Because I think there are going to be needs that we're just not privy or in tune to. So we've got 7 folks who have answered so far, 8. We'll wait just a couple more seconds. 11, thank you. See if we can get one more to 12. Okay. Oh, 13, fabulous. Okay, Evelyn, is it okay if we go ahead and end the poll and show the results quickly? Thank you. So it looks like ability to fund projects, ability to fund programs and planning. Those are the top 2 with 9 out of 13 responses and 8 out of 13 responses. Close behind that is operations and maintenance, as well as grant funds to parishes, municipalities, and or other organizations. So this is helpful, y'all, as we think about the resources discussion, as well as this relationships discussion. So thank you. Whoops, that's a fun fact. Okay, Evelyn, can we take a screenshot of this and make sure that we get this in the notes? Can't tell if I'm getting a thumbs up, but all right. So I think let's move on to the next polling question. I'll have to get through this quickly. Thank y'all for hanging in there. So our second question is, Of the following funding mechanisms, which you can see the explainers for these in your packet, which are you the most familiar with? Once again, you can select multiple if you'd like. Thank you, Evelyn, for posting that on here. So local sales taxes, shared cost and joint agreements, tax increment financing or TIF, and special assessment districts, community and corporate foundations, public-private partnerships, impact investing and environmental impact bonds, federal grants and loans. And once again, we have unsure, none of the above, and other. If you state other, please put that in the chat pod.
Rachel, it's only allowing you to pick one.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
Asking about what you're most familiar with. The highest level of familiarity, I believe.
If there are others that people are familiar with and you want to state that, you can put that in the chat pod. I thought that we had it selected for multiple, but sometimes that happens sometimes. And we thank Evelyn and Risa and everybody for coordinating our polls. These meetings would literally not be possible without them.
Sorry about that, y'all. I thought we wanted it that way. My mistake. So yeah, please add to your second selection if you have a second point that you would have liked to select.
It was probably a lost in translation thing, Evelyn, so I apologize on my end. Thank you for putting it together. All right, and we do have 14, so we can go ahead and end, and we'll share. Looks like those federal grants and loans, people are really familiar with that, which is fantastic. And then the next is shared cost and joint agreements, public-private partnerships, and local sales taxes. And so we'll go ahead and move on to the next question, y'all, which is, you know, of these mechanisms, you know, what might be the mechanisms for funding, perhaps for this potential organizational structure? If we can pull up that polling question, it's literally the exact same one. Might be able to select multiple. Yep, thank you. Everyone's shaking her head. Thank you so much. So just select as many as you think. If there's other, state it in the chat pod. And once again, it is okay if you click unsure. It is okay if you click none of the above. You're not going to hurt our feelings. Y'all got the hang of the polling quickly. It's getting a lot of responses now. I guess it also helps that it's the same information. Okay. That's a lot of folks. So we'll go ahead and end polling so I can get my taskbar out of the way. And we'll share the results. So it looks like quite a few folks said, let me see, the most said federal grants and loans. It's 12 out of 14. With the next being shared costs and joint agreements. So I think that's really helpful information as we think about the resources conversation. Again, I know we're flying through this. I promise this was just an attempt to crack the egg and for us on the project team to just get an understanding of kind of what is the level of understanding, where are some places where we can provide some supporting information, and what are y'all kind of already thinking so that we can you know, really think about what is the information that we can provide to be most supportive as y'all deliberate. Oop, there we go. So we are going to move to the public comment period. There we go. Do we have anybody who is not a regional, well, or a regional steering committee member or the public who would like to make a public comment at this point in time? Please unmute yourself, or you can put it in the chat box. If you are speaking, I have a little timer here for 2 minutes just for the sake of time. We'll do a little pause just in case people are kind of thinking and trying to get off mute. Like I need some fun elevator music here. Or I could say we could do like the LSU fight song, but I'm a state fan, so I'm not sure that I could actually do that. I think y'all might like that though.
I do have something, but I'm kind of waiting on you to call somebody else first.
Okay.
It sounds like somebody's off mute, but I can't tell. I know Chuck just spoke. You know, somebody in the background. Anybody have anything?
I do. Russell Kelly, can you hear me?
Sure
Hello.
can. I got your timer. Here we go.
Yeah, okay. One of my main concerns is making sure we get objective data into the system. You know, we're relying on partner sources to get information in, but all of that information isn't always correct. So we have to be open enough to accept other sources of information if we're going to solve this and get it right the first time. And, you know, I'm a resource on that. Plenty of information that needs to be known. So just keep that in mind.
Not want to be around.
Yeah, much appreciated, Russell. You know, and I think as we had talked about citizen involvement, right? That's you're somebody who has been involved for quite some time. So just wanted to flag that. Thank you, Russell.
Free anyway. Okay, cool.
Are there other folks? Do you want to say something, Chuck?
I'll start off by just saying thanks to Russell. That's kind of what I had hinted at before. There's a lot of different things that are going on here, different groups, and there's different layers of data that they're looking at. And there's going to be an organized outreach to seek some of that data. It hasn't all occurred yet, but you're right. You're a holder of some of that data, and we all are, because we all live here, you know. But I wanted to say that a lot of you have heard me say this before, and will hear me say it again, is that a lot of the tools that we've used in the past have science and data have shown them to be not the most appropriate tool in some cases, and have significant adverse impacts to environment, ecology, and other conditions, you know. With that in mind, we are exploring nature-based solutions and laying out a training curriculum for that. And we're looking at getting that out to the decision makers and regional steering committees. So when that becomes available, which we're looking at early part of 2021, be ready for something like that, because it's going to blow your mind. I've seen the list of it. It's pretty amazing and pretty intensive, but it's going to be multi-sessions, multi-modules, you know, so it's not going to be one class and done. There's so many different aspects to it. You know, there's natural channel design, there's conservation easements, there's a whole bunch of different things. So take advantage of it when it's come. The fact that the Watershed Initiative is looking at, you know, providing funding for something like that is quite amazing.
It is. Thanks, Chuck. I think that's a really good FYI for folks in this group. There is more support, more training, more things that are on the way. They're just being developed. There any other public comments from folks? It's been a long pause. Okay. Well, Chuck and Ross, are we okay to move on from the public comment section of our meeting?
Yep.
I think so.
Okay. We'll move into the closeout section. So as we've discussed, there is a process here. Our next meeting is on November 19th, and we will build out the resources and begin to think about the reporting part of our governance structure. So stay tuned. This is a journey, if you will. One thing that I do want to point out, we only have 2 minutes left in the meeting, is that for our regional steering committee members specifically, you should have received an email from me for Watershed Initiative Model Focus Groups. And within that email, there were links to sign up. Originally, the sign up sheet had special privileged access. That should be removed. So please sign up for one of those. They're really focus groups to hear about who the modeling stakeholders are in your area. What are the primary reasons that models need to be updated? How will those updates occur? What level of interest and capacity do local and regional stakeholders have for storing and maintaining those? So that's really the opportunity for y'all to say, these are what our needs are. And this is the model development and data group that's hosting that. So once again, they're working across the state and they want to hear from y'all. I will be sure to put in a follow-up email the links for this once again. Okay, and we have 1 minute left. So Chuck and Ross, if y'all want to lead us through the adoption of our October 13th meeting minutes.
Yep, I need a motion to adopt.
Motion we adopt.
Is that Ronnie?
Yes.
Need a second?
I'll second.
Bridget, second. All in favor?
Aye.
Yay.
Aye.
Aye.
That sounds like a winner to me. Any opposed? I didn't hear any opposed, so.
Motion carries.
Thank y'all. Y'all are getting very good at that virtually. It's quite impressive, to be honest. Even coming off mute and saying aye. So we do have an upcoming meeting, November 19th from 1 to 3:30. I didn't necessarily, I heard some action items that I was writing down. So, you know, maybe having something that explains organizations and what they do in the future. And then also sending y'all that model focus group information in our follow-up email for the steering committees. For those of you who are listening in, who are not regional steering committee members, we will have this post-meeting information online at crpcla.org/previous events. Just give us a couple of days. It was just myself and then our fabulous web designer, Marta, who works to get that information on the website afterwards. So stay tuned. There will be a follow-up email that references that specific place on our website where you can get that information. As always, visit the LWI website at watershed.la.gov and follow LWI on social media for more information. They have a Twitter, an Instagram, a Facebook, couple of different things. So it's good to keep up with information at the state level from there too. The last thing that I want to say before we have the motion to close is just thank you for spending your time with us. The day before people vote in a federal election, several days, not even several days, a few days after a hurricane in the midst of a global pandemic. We cannot thank y'all enough for your time with us. And we hope that this discussion was collaborative and that it was helpful. So that's all I have to say. Chuck and Ross.
Nope, just want to say thank y'all again. And really like the incorporation of the polling into the meetings. I think it gives people an opportunity to express where they have experience in certain items and less in certain areas. And we can use those to our advantage on how we craft our messaging and data requests, you know, moving forward. So I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you and all your team and your hard work. Chuck?
Thank you, everybody.
Motion
All
to
I got to say. A motion.
Second?
Bridget,
Second.
Earl with second.
That was me.
All right. Motion carries. See y'all on the 19th.
Thanks, y'all. We'll talk to you later.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.